Yes, so I think we're now officially live. I've got a notification on my screen saying we're being streamed on YouTube for all those people who are sat eagerly waiting for our meeting to start. Welcome to the first corporate governance and audit meeting that is being held on Zoom. We held a previous one on Public Eye, but now we've moved to Zoom. Hopefully this will be as effective. As previously, it'd be really helpful if you are not speaking, if you mute your microphone. That just helps reduce feedback and hopefully stops any echoes. If you've got any questions, as you might do, or want to comment, please raise your hand. If I don't see you, please maybe wave at the screen, and I'll try and bring you in. So thank you very much for joining, and we will crack on with the meeting. So we'll start at the beginning. So item 1, John, appeals against refusal of inspection of documents.
There are no appeals against the refusal of documents. Under item 2, there are no items which require the exclusion of the press or public. I'm not aware of any late items of business. Under agenda item 4, could I ask members to declare any disclosable pecuniary interests? I'll assume there's none. In terms of apologies for absence, we've got Councillor Mark Harrison.
Thank you very much, John. Okay, moving on to the minutes of the previous meeting on page 7 of your pack. Are we happy they are an accurate record?
Chair, it's Jonathan, so I couldn't find my blue hand.
That's okay.
I was omitted from the list of councillors present in the meeting in the minutes, and I know I was there.
I'll correct that, Chair.
Thank you. Any other apologies for that, Jonathan?
No problem.
Any other issues with the minutes that people want to raise? No. Okay, we'll take those subject to the change as an accurate record. On to matters arising. I'll pass over to Kate, please.
Only one matter arising from me, Chair, and that's minute 10, page 10, the applications portfolio programme. Members have received updates in relation to the progress on the project, and separately in relation to the governance and escalation processes. That's just to confirm that that's happened.
Thank you, Kate. Does anyone else want to raise any matters arising at this stage? No. Okay. We'll move on to agenda item 8, and we've got Tim here to present his paper. Can you assume that we've read the paper when you give your presentation, and then I'll open it up for questions. Thank you very much, Tim.
That's right. Good morning, everybody. Tim Rollitt from the Council's Intelligence and Policy Service, presenting the report on the effectiveness of our risk management arrangements. The report looks back at the arrangements that we had in place in 1920, but also additional work that we've got planned for this year. You'll see from the report that the risks can arise from a variety of sources, some of which are outside our control, for example, prolonged adverse weather or pandemic. Some of those risks are also more controllable by the council, for example, a major IT failure or a cyber attack. I think it's fair to say over the past few months, local government has seen lots of these risks happen. So it's very real. It's a very real report. In terms of our arrangements, I'll go over the key arrangements that we have. We still have a corporate risk register, which is supported by directorate and service level risk registers. The corporate register obviously captures all the most significant cross-cutting risks facing the council. We update and report those risks to various boards and management teams, including the corporate leadership team, who review that corporate register. In terms of the arrangements, we also provide a report each June to our executive board that covers what those significant risks are and provides assurances on those risks, how the risks are being managed and what more do we need to do. And obviously you'll see from the report to the committee today that we've included a link to the executive board report, and that report was reviewed back in June. We also can't do risk management by ourselves, so we undertake risk in conjunction with partner organisations. One of the most significant ones is the West Yorkshire Resilience Forum. And so that looks at a wide range of resilience type risks that face the council. One of the other big things that we've done this year is we've replaced our aging 4Risk software with an in-house developed SharePoint site that saved us the license fee. And that SharePoint site is a lot easier to use and is a lot less cluttered than 4Risk. It's still in its infancy, and we are planning a user survey later in the municipal year to find out how people are finding that new system. Some of the other things that we've carried on doing in terms of the risk management arrangements, delivering workshops and risk management training. And obviously now we're in a slightly different world. We're going to have to adapt that training and those workshops to undertake them more remotely. So we're not going to put the pause on those. If we need to do them, we have a plan for delivering those sessions remotely if we need to. Moving on to the arrangements for this year. We provide an awful lot of support to the council's coronavirus pandemic response and recovery. So obviously there's the gold, silver, multi-agency response arrangements, and members of the Intelligence and Policy Service provide risk management support for a wide range of groups that feed into the corporate risk that we have on the coronavirus pandemic, and that risk is being updated each month and reported to Executive Board. You'll notice from the report that we've also recently updated the Best Council plan to reflect a lot of the safety and other aspects from the coronavirus pandemic. And so one of the things that we will do again is have a look at our risk management policy just to make sure that is up to date and fit for purpose, taking into account those changes. Another important point to make out for the risk management arrangements this year is that it's more than just the coronavirus pandemic. We can't afford to take our eye off some of the other big risks that could happen. And in particular, these are things around Brexit. There could be prolonged adverse weather during the winter. And also, what if there's another different type of health pandemic, such as flu? So it's really important that we sort of keep our eye on the ball with risks and not just sort of focus on the big obvious one. Another fairly important risk that we're obviously involved with is the financial risk facing the council and the challenges around balancing our budget, both in the short term and the medium term. And you'll notice from the report that the head of business planning and risk is quite heavily involved in the work that's been undertaken along with Victoria and Richard in sort of addressing that challenge. So just to conclude, these are, from a risk management point of view, incredibly challenging times for our arrangements, and they're really being put to the test. However, you could also say that it's a good time because this is why we have the risk management arrangements, and they appear to be standing up quite well in terms of what we're facing at the moment. So I'm quite happy to take any questions on the report.
Thank you very much, Tim. I'll open up to councillors who want to comment. Looks like there's not many comments at the moment. So I just had a question. Go on, Peter. Yeah. Councillor Hammond.
My hand isn't gone. Just a simple matter of fact. Does the risk register include the Grand Theatre?
In what respect would is the risk around the Grand Theatre?
There are risks attached to the financial future of the Grand Theatre with obvious commitments for expenditure and no income. I don't want a detailed answer now, just assurance that you're aware of the risks attached to the Grand Theatre.
Yeah, that's quite an interesting point because that would be at a more sort of directorate or operational level. And so I can find out around that, because again, it's one of a number of establishments that are facing that same challenge, the income, reduced income, but with expenditure going up or staying the same. So it's one of a number of council establishments that will be facing that challenge. So I can find out for you there.
Thank you.
So I think we talked about sort of the directorate risk versus the corporate risks last year when we talked about this risk register, and so I think in terms of that, the assurance around the directorate is looking at it, and a scrutiny board is aware that they could look at it if needed, would be helpful, Tim. I can see that Councillor Garner is indicated to speak.
Thank you, Chair. Just on 3.1.4 and the sort of the risks that are always going to be around, is there a risk of the same people being accountable for most of those risks? And I see that Neil Evans and Councillor Lewis have kind of got a bad deal there. Is that a risk within itself, that our main risks that are really unlikely to go away, are mainly accountable by a couple of people, notwithstanding that the executive board and directors will have sort of joint responsibility, but the accountability resting with a couple of people in the main?
That's a good point that you've made there, and fortunately, although Neil Evans and Councillor Lewis seem to have quite a lot of responsibility, in actual fact they rely on a team of people underneath them to help administer those risks. So for example, we've got a couple of really big financial risks there. Well, Victoria and Richard, who are in this meeting now, will update Neil on those risks. So he's not doing this in isolation on his own. He's got quite a wide range of support there. So if something were to happen to Neil, somebody else would also be able to step in and sort of take on the management of those risks too.
Councillor Scopes, could I also come in on that?
I was just bringing you in, but I left myself on mute, so please do.
I'd also say that identified in the report of the lead accountable person. However, all the corporate leadership team have responsibility for each of those risks, because the corporate risks, so each of the directors would have responsibility as well as Neil. So for example, health and safety, it's just that he's the lead person on that one. Okay, thank you.
Councillor Garner, did you want to come back on that?
No, that's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Illingworth.
Oh, thank you, Chair. Yes, I was looking at the top right-hand corner of the risk map, the highly significant risks that are almost certain to happen. Yes, can we quantify these any better than this? Obviously, it's an ongoing process, but it is a very bizarre situation where we can see obvious risks and we'd be foolish to ignore them, but we can't do a great deal about some of them.
That's right. The technical term there is that you accept the risk, which is that you do as much as you possibly can to manage and mitigate those risks. But no matter how much you do with some of the risks, there will always be what we call residual elements, which means that something could still happen. So that's the technical term. Now, ideally, with those risks in the top right-hand corner, the red risks, we put in place controls and actions in order to manage those risks down as much as we can with the resources that we've got. So over the coming year, as we continue dealing with the pandemic, as we continue to manage the financial position of the council, those risks in that red corner should start to reduce. It's a bit too early to start taking them down just yet, because there's still lots of work to do, but that's generally the what we do with those risks.
I'm thinking particularly the loss of income risk, for council activities. It's we're in an impossible situation there. It's not of our making.
That's right, and like we say, some of these risks are to a certain extent outside our control. So we're obviously bound by the government instruction as to which of our establishments we can open, and the social distancing impact on those establishments. So particularly things like the cafes, etc., that we have. So to some extent, we've got to comply. Obviously, we've got to comply with the government instruction, but at the same time, we know that it's going to have an adverse impact on the income.
Thank you.
Thank you. I can't see anyone else is indicating to speak. Do we have any other questions? No. I'd like to say thanks for this report, Tim. I think I know I asked for it to be more focused on sort of the process to be in line with our terms of reference as a committee, and I think that has been really helpful that it is, particularly around understanding who's responsible, who's looking at the risk in detail. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
And I appreciate that. I think we're going to move on to item 9 now. So I think you're free to go if you want to, Tim. Good. Okay. Moving on to item 9. This is, I think this is Victoria or Mary speaking.
It's myself, Councillor.
Ah, sorry, Richard.
Sorry. Yes, I was the third one on the list. Just referring to and briefly running through item 9. This report was brought forward at the request of the meeting of the last Corporate Governance and Audit Committee, who wanted to see that appropriate procedures and processes are in place should there be a requirement to agree emergency budget in this year, and also provides assurance to members that the council remains a financial going concern. With reference to the report, the background information, I think most people are aware of that, and clearly Tim referred to it earlier, just in terms of the financial challenges facing this local authority and many local authorities, and the reported budget gap or funding gap they've got in 2020-21. Picking up just on the main issues, section 3.1 puts the details, the arrangements in place for setting an emergency budget, should there be a requirement for that in this current financial year. And similarly, if there's a requirement for the authority to issue a section 114 report, section 3.2 details that requirement as well. 3.3 just sets out what the terms of reference are of the Corporate Governance and Audit Committee, and that's to review the adequacy of policies and practices to ensure compliance with statutory and other guidance. And also it gives the assurance to members is that should there be a requirement for an emergency budget to be adopted by full council, then this committee would be updated to give assurances that the processes have been followed, comply with both the council's own governance arrangements and statutory requirements as well. In respect of section 3.4, going concern and financial health, it references the statement of accounts 2019-20, which is the next paper on this agenda, and the requirement for them to be prepared on a going concern basis. But in terms of the local authority becoming more sustainable, and it references the medium-term financial strategy, which is now over a 5-year period, and the direction of travel being to make it more financially sustainable, the authority's finances, with less reliance upon short-term solutions to fund recurring expenditure. It also references the financial health reports of the authority in terms of the monthly reporting to Executive Board, and COVID-19 impacts aside, the ability of the council to deliver the required level of budgeted savings to deliver a balanced budget position. It also references the position with regard to Grant Thornton's comments with regard to the maintenance level of reserves at 5%. And at 3.4.5, it also references a letter received by the council's chief financial officer from Grant Thornton, which amongst other things, states that it's fully supportive of the measure, so that Leeds City Council are taking to help bring the council's finances back into balance and comply with statutory duties. And a copy of that letter can be found in Appendix 1. So the report concludes is that there's prescribed procedures and requirements to follow if an emergency budget is to be set, that the council continues to remain a financial going concern, and that the council's external auditors are fully supportive of the measures being taken by the council to bring its finances back into balance. The recommendation is that members of this committee just note that there are appropriate procedures and processes in place. So thank you, Chair. If there's any questions from members, I'm sure myself and Victoria will be able to answer them.
Thank you very much. And as I said at Chair's brief, I appreciated the point of 3.4.1 around the accounts being a going concern, because I know certainly something I'd been asking about at the last meeting, and it might bring some clarity there. Can I bring in Councillor Bentley, please?
Thank you, Chair. It's not a question, it's a comment, really. I just wanted to, from my point of view, because I think I raised it at the last meeting, I think this is exactly what I was looking for, which was a very clear statement of how we work through from where we are now to where we may end up, and the involvement of this committee where it needs to be involved, and the involvement of elected members. So I found that as an assurance document, and that's all we're looking for. We're not looking for sort of the detail of why we get to this point. It's how we deal with it. And also I thought the letter from Grant Thornton, sort of the agreement letter between Grant Thornton and the Chief Officer of Financial Services, was really good at encapsulating what the way forward was. So I'm very happy with the document. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Bentley. Well done, Richard. And moving on to Councillor Trustwell, please.
Thank you, Chair. Can I start by apologising for entering the meeting a little late? My broadband connection is fluctuating wildly at the moment, so I may even disappear during the course of these questions. I just wanted to pick up a couple of points on page 31 of the agenda. It's the second page of Gareth's letter. The second paragraph makes reference to service reviews, and particularly of areas where the council is an outlier in terms of cost of service delivery. Is that term outlier in comparison to other core cities or statistical neighbours, and where are we in terms of that particular exercise? And the second point, again on the same page, I think it's the 7th paragraph, relates to categorising spending and income in relation to the pandemic. And I just wondered how far we'd progressed in terms of that piece of work, whether we could have a little bit more elaboration on that. Thank you.
So I answer both.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Victoria.
Hi, thank you. The first one around the service reviews and the work that we're undertaking around identifying where we're an outlier is the benchmarking exercise that we undertook quite a lot of work last year around benchmarking, and we're building on that again this year. So the directorates are already on with that, and the outcome of that review will be reported to Exec Board in September. Where it says we're an outlier, it is a term where we compare ourselves against our statistical neighbours, but also core cities. And we review to see where we may be high cost or where our demand is higher than other areas. And it just gives us an indicator or a key line of inquiry to do some further work and to take that further. It might not generate any savings. There could be good reasons why we're an outlier in those areas, but it gives us a key area to start looking at and reviewing, which is what the directorates are undertaking at the moment. On the second part of the question around categorising the income and expenditure, that is something that we have been doing since we unfortunately experienced the impact of COVID-19 on the finances. And we've been reporting that through to MHCLG, and we are further reporting it through to Executive Board. And that's so that we understand where the pressures are, which are the areas that we can mitigate and manage, and which are the areas that we're asking for further government support on. So I don't know if there's any further questions on those two areas.
No, thanks for that, Victoria. I'm fine with that, those responses. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I'm going to bring in Councillor Illingworth, but just as he's unmuting, Councillor Bentley and Trustwell, if you, once you've made your comment, if you take your hand back down unless you want to comment again, which is fine, obviously. Thank you very much. Councillor Illingworth.
Yes, as Chair, I was going to ask about expanding into new areas, because been much press comment about the fact that local authorities generally do a fairly efficient job and compare quite well with Serco and the likes that are implementing central measures. It's not beyond the bounds of possibility that the government might see sense and recognise that local authority provision is quite efficient. And I would be embarrassed at that point to find that we couldn't expand, take on new responsibilities quickly. So has any thought been given, particularly in terms of contact tracing and relief of poverty, where we might actually do a better job than the boss?
Who wants to come? Thanks, Victoria.
All right, thank you. For the new areas of responsibility, I think as part of our reviews that we're undertaking, directorates do look at areas where we would be able to support or provide services to generate income for the council, and that is one of the things that we do constantly look at. And we have seen where we've been doing the track and trace, etc., for central government, where we've received funding to undertake that piece of work. So what I would say is that it's a reiterative process. We're always looking at ways that we can generate more income for the council to either provide services or to help support other service areas. If we've got some specific answers, some specific examples, we could have a look at those as a possibility, if that would help. Thank you.
I'd like to do that, but I'd like time to think about it first and not ask daft questions off the cuff. I'd like to prepare.
Councillor, if you'd like to send me an email once you've had a think about it, then I'll have a look into them for you. Thank you.
Thanks, Victoria. Richard, do you want to come in?
It's just to add to what Victoria was saying, Chair, is that the council has set up a trading company, CEL, as a private company, that if there are opportunities to trade with other local authorities or with the private sector, then the mechanisms are there. So just to reassure Councillor Illingworth that if there is an opportunity there, we've got the structure in place to take advantage of that in terms of the company we've got in place. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Councillor Harrand.
Thanks, Chair. This may be the wrong place to raise this, but there's reference in this letter to discussions with the government. Well, how does that happen? Do we have a group of people from Leeds go down to London and talk about it? Or is it all done generally through the LGA or the core cities together? Because we could get picked up individually if we go separately. And how many local authorities are there? Hundreds? How does the government actually work?
Thank you. Bring in Victoria here.
Thank you, Chair. It works by, I have a number of meetings with MHCLG where we have telephone conversations like this, and they've been happening on a weekly, fortnightly basis, depending when we've required, just to keep them up to speed on where we are. We also have calls with MHCLG with the core cities, which I attend, and Tom as Chief Exec, and also the other directors will be having conversations with government through their networks and links into central government. So we are in contact with them all the time. If we did need to take it to the next phase on the further discussions, then we would have specific meetings with MHCLG, who would then speak to the Treasurer. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Councillor Harrand.
Supplementary. Do we get our MPs involved in that?
I'm not sure. I'd have to find out for you. I don't include the MPs, but I'm sure Tom, as Chief Exec, would be speaking to the MPs. But I will double check that for you because I can't say completely on that.
I'd be interested. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, I think it's a valid question. If we're lobbying for extra resources, using our MPs to help us lobby. So thank you for that, Councillor Harrand. Richard, did you want to come in again?
Sorry, Chair, that was my arm was raised.
No, that's all right.
Cancelled it. Apologies for that. I'll take it down.
Yeah. Okay. And Gareth, do you want to comment at this point?
It was just going back to the previous discussion around the potential for effectively bringing services back in house or a service company to deliver it. It was just a comparison with what I've seen at a number of my NHS clients, Chair. So a number of my NHS hospitals have actually set up separate sort of facilities management type companies that are wholly owned by the main hospital to bring certain services back in house around, sort of estates, cleaning, that type of stuff, procurement, so that I suppose the income and the savings generated are kept within the NHS family. So it is something that certainly has started to happen in the NHS sector that, obviously Leeds and other authorities are looking at now to, to try and retain that level of income and savings for the future. So it is something that I do see in other sectors as well, Chair.
Thank you for that, Gareth. Okay, so I think that's all the comments. So are we satisfied to accept the recommendation on page 29 of the pack? I'll take that silence as agreement. So thank you very much. And I've also just realised we didn't formally accept the recommendations on page 21 of agenda item 8. So can we formally accept those as well? It's on page 21. Again, I'll accept silence as agreement. Thank you very much. So we will now move on to agenda item 10, the corporate from Mary.
Thank you, Chair. So the reports present the draft statement of accounts which are currently on deposit for the public inspection period. Grant Thornton's audit is underway now, and the intention is that the final audited accounts will be brought back to the committee for approval in October. There are a couple of issues to highlight this year arising from the impact of the coronavirus. Firstly, in terms of going concern, as previously referred to, the accounts are produced on a going concern basis, and that is a requirement for local authorities such as ourselves. The reason for that is that the going concern test in accounting standards simply asks whether or not an entity will continue for the foreseeable future, and the statutory basis for local authorities means that basically, as we don't have the ability to wind ourselves up, even if we are in financial difficulties, that going concern test would always be passed. CIPFA have issued specific guidance this year reminding authorities that that is the case, and also recommending that in the circumstances forward should include commentary on the financial impact of the coronavirus. So members will have seen that section 1 of our forward this year highlights both the scale and the uncertainty of the financial challenge that's facing us going forward. In terms of the accounting statements themselves, as the lockdown started very shortly before the end of our financial year, there's been the majority of the financial impact of that will hit in the new financial year, and the accounts themselves present a relatively healthy financial position with an increase in the council's net worth. The biggest impact has actually been in terms of uncertainty in valuation, in particular of land and property assets. So the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors issued a valuation practice alert advising their members that material uncertainty was likely to attach to all property valuations during the relevant period. So as a result, our statement of accounts include quite a lot of additional narrative disclosure within the notes at relevant points. It's not clear at the moment at what stage robust valuations will be able to be carried out again. So we will be revisiting that with the valuers in September to ask them whether at that stage they can now do valid valuations, and if so, whether there's been any significant change in the value of the council's assets. If by the time we get to late September there is a measurable change in the value of the council's assets, then we will potentially be looking at a post-balance sheet event disclosure within the final audited accounts, because obviously that will be telling us that there had been a significant change by halfway through the next financial year. It wouldn't be giving us any information as to what the value was at the end of March. We will also be reviewing the level of major bad debt provisions before we bring the final audited accounts back in October, just to confirm whether, with the benefit of hindsight, the provisions we've put into the accounts are sufficient. One final issue to highlight, members may have seen from the balance sheet that the level of cash equivalents and short-term investments on the balance sheet is considerably higher than it would have been in other years. In view of the potential risk to liquidity, the Treasury Management team did borrow an additional 100 million from the PWLB right towards the end of March, and that is reflected in the balance sheet position. So that was really all I wanted to highlight in terms of the accounts. We will be organising informal briefing sessions for members probably in mid to late September, but obviously I'd be happy to try to answer any questions that members have now on the accounts.
Thank you very much, Mary, and appreciate your agreement to provide those extra briefing sessions. I've seen Councillor Bentley.
Thanks, Chair. Just a specific question, which I could have picked up earlier, actually. The long-term debtors figure is increased significantly on the balance sheet, and that's contributed to the overall increase in current assets, I think. Can you just give us some examples of what those long-term debtors are, and what the risk is to us actually getting that debt repaid in the due time?
Councillor, the big increase in the long-term debtors is almost entirely due to finance lease in and out arrangements which we've entered into. So there are increases in long-term debtors, and there are equal opposite increases in the deferred liability figure on the balance sheet. So the first one of those relates to the Headingley Stadium, the north-south stand. So that is 37 million both in and out. And the other one relates to the TV studio in the Wellington Road area. That's around 6 million. So those are the two big increases in long-term debtors. I understand that in terms of the Headingley Stadium, the clubs are up to date currently with their payments. We do have security also for those leases. So in the event of default, we do have other income streams we can call on. But I believe there are negotiations underway with the clubs in terms of the future. In terms of the Whitehall studio, there was actually a rent-free period at the start of that lease, so the issue of default hasn't arisen yet on that one.
Can I come back, Chair? With the Headingley Stadium, obviously there's been no income for the cricket club this season. I'm not too sure what their financial position is, but it can't be that good. And although we have security, that security presumably is the stadium or the stands in the stadium. It's their asset, which if it's not produce any income, I don't know how good that would be for us to take on a cricket ground. So unless the security in other ways, some personal guarantees from the directors or something like that, do you have any information on that?
There is other security. Yes, we have security in terms of the income stream which the cricket team is entitled to from the ECB.
Okay, thank you. It would be worthwhile, perhaps, not necessarily bringing it back to the meeting, but just a briefing note of exactly what the arrangements are and what our risks are, particularly with unlikely to be any profit or income for the cricket club within the near future.
Yeah, I understand, Councillor, that negotiations are currently underway, so I'm not sure at what stage those have got to, but we will ask for a briefing note on that.
Thank you. I can't see anyone else indicating. I had a question on page 25 in terms of the pensions. So last year, the accounting assumptions were more prudent than the technical provisions, the valuation assumptions. And as I can see, the deficit has increased. I was wondering, in your view, is that because the position has materially got worse, or whether the assumptions are still more prudent than the valuation assumptions?
I think the biggest factor in that increase this year has been the performance of the assets during the year. So in terms of the accounting standards, that the actuaries are required to take the position as at 1st of April each year in terms of looking at the assumptions going forward, and the performance of the pension fund's assets during the year has been worse than would have been anticipated at that stage. The gross liabilities, I think, have actually reduced, Councillor, partly because of the mortality assumptions, where I think the assumptions on the length of life somewhat depressingly have reduced right across the board this year. The other factor is that liability includes the effect of the McLeod judgment, which members may recall last year we had to introduce part way through between the draft accounts and the final accounts last year. The government did actually last week publish proposed remedy in terms of the local government pension scheme for McLeod. So that is potentially something that we may need to look at before final audited accounts, as to whether what the government are proposing is in line with what the actuaries assumed last year.
Okay, thanks for that. I can see that Councillor Illingworth has indicated.
Just a quick question, Chair. What page are we on? I seem to have lost my place.
Oh, sorry, I was on page 25 of the accounts rather than
yes. Okay,
the pack. Sorry for the confusion. It's just I mean, it's probably quite a technical question about the liabilities. Okay, thank you for that, Mary. I don't think there's any other questions on your report. So if are members satisfied to accept the recommendations on page 38 of the meeting pack?
Yes.
Yes, great. Thank you very much. Thank you for that, Mary. That's very helpful.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on to agenda item 11 and over to Kate.
Thank you, Chair. This report presents the interim annual governance statement, which in its current form has been drafted and signed off by officers, but will be brought back to this committee for final signature in its final form alongside the accounts. It's been published and placed on deposit alongside the draft accounts from the 6th of July. Members will note that when it comes back, there may well be amendments to it arising from any public comment that comes in whilst on draft, anything that our external auditors raise with us around the content, and any significant developments in terms of the assurances set out in the report. There will also obviously be those minor amendments to change the tense of what's said within the report, with it being in its interim stage. The AGS includes assurances that are drawn from a variety of sources. New this year in terms of the way it's presented, there are now 2 annexes to the AGS. One gives the key actions that were set out in last year's statement, together with the progress that's been made against those, so it allows for an easier check than ploughing through the full detail of the statement. And then secondly, there's an annex setting out the 20 new key actions proposed for 2020. The plan is to develop an action plan around those key actions so that they can be reported back to the committee during the course of the year so that you can track progress against your annual governance statement. So that's all I've got to say.
Thank you for that, Kate. Members got any questions or comments? I'll start with Councillor Trustwell.
Yes, Chair, thank you. It's a very minor governance point, but on page 41, paragraph 4.5.3, it says the regulations require that the AGS is considered and approved by members, and in Leeds, this role is delegated to Corporate Governance and Audit Committee, which is obviously a great privilege on our part. But I just wonder what the logic was behind that. Why isn't it exec board or full council that gives the report member approval?
I think that probably the logic is that full council is not the most wieldy of meetings for discussing the complex detail. It sits alongside the accounts and supports the accounts. Why not exec board? Because it's a council function, and executive board can't undertake a council function. So that one's simple, but there has been a choice by members through the terms of reference to the Corporate Governance and Audit Committee to delegate the approval of the annual governance statement to yourselves within those terms of reference.
Okay, thanks, Kate.
So means extra responsibility on us to scrutinise it very carefully in the next over time. So I recognise
no pressure
that.
then, Chair.
Yeah, absolutely. Gareth, do you have a comment?
It was just to say, Chair, that the approach at Leeds is the norm across my local authority clients in terms of, you know, the accounts and the annual governance statement sitting alongside in part of the audit committee's remit. So it's just to say that, you know, you're no different to the vast majority of my other local authority clients.
Thank you for that, Gareth. Okay, I can't see anyone else indicating. The recommendation on page 42, 5.1 is we note the interim annual governance statement. Hopefully that's not too controversial. Clearly, if you've got comments or concerns about anything in it at all, feel free to contact myself and Kate about it, and I'm sure we can find a way forward. But assuming no one objects to us accepting that recommendation, I'm going to move on to agenda item 12, which is on page 109, and hand back over to Kate.
Thank you. Yes, it's the work programme that you know and love. You approved it in March. You recognised at the last meeting that it had been tweaked somewhat to accommodate the changing dates around the accounts and AGS cycle. Just to point up that in the version that you have in the work programme today, those 3 items that had to be moved from this meeting, so approval of the AGS and the accounts and to receive the internal audit opinion, have been moved, and a date has been fixed for October the 16th. So that's Friday the 16th of October, at which time hopefully the chair will be in a position to sign off those formal documents on your behalf.
Yeah, hopefully we can work with those, and I thank the committee for the flexibility in terms of I know, particularly the accounts, the dates being a bit fluid, but I think we are somewhere good now. Unless anyone has some comments, I'm going to ask us to approve the recommendation on page 110, 6.1.1. which, unless I hear otherwise, I'll assume we've got agreement for. Good. Well, I think that might be a record time Corporate Governance and Audit Committee meeting, mainly thanks to the fact that the accounts are later than usual this year, which has got to be one small benefit of the current situation. But with that, I thank everyone very much for joining and look forward to seeing you in the near future.
Thank you, Chair.